Hi, welcome to another special episode with a very, very special guest, a long-awaited special guest. I'm pleased to say that I'm going to be speaking to a certified sex therapist who has a PhD in human sexuality and has done some fascinating research looking at Latin American women and Middle Eastern women and Muslim women. She's based in the United States of America. Dr. Stefania Simich Muñoz. How are you? Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me here, Habib. I really appreciate the opportunity to share.
No, no, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Being a fan of your work, and we will talk a little bit about the wonderful research that you've done and some of the services that you offer. But before we start, do you mind giving a quick high-level elevator pitch in terms of who you are and why you have become a sex therapist, like your passion behind it?
Absolutely. Such an existential question, but let's let's narrow it down into the professional setting. Um, can you can you hear me okay? Just
I can hear
making
you
sure.
perfectly, yeah.
Habib. Oh, you can hear me okay. Okay. I just like see a delay. Um, So I'm Dr. Estefanía Simich Muñoz. I'm a certified sex therapist through AASECT. I'm a certified sex therapist supervisor as well. So I supervise sex therapists across the globe. Um, like you mentioned, I'm a doctor in critical studies of human sexuality. So I see sexuality through an intersectional lens, and taking into account systems of oppression. And I own a private practice here in Baltimore, Maryland, in the US. I am an immigrant from Peru, and I've been in the United States for many years. And I lived here in the US. I've lived as an adult in Peru, as well as the Netherlands, and spent a little bit of time also in South Africa. So I've been working with different populations throughout my career as a therapist and as a sex therapist.
Wow, fascinating. So you're originally from Peru's in South America, is that correct?
Okay.
And then you
Yes,
also said that you've had some experience, obviously, in North America where you're based and also South America. So, what are some of the common issues that you found working across different cultures in terms of sex and intimacy being a therapist?
the beauty is that we're all human beings and we perceive sexuality in different ways. And of course, based on our sociocultural backgrounds and our stories, right? Even ancestral stories that we bring, we see sexuality in different ways. So the commonality would be that we all carry this backpack of unconscious and conscious perceptions on sexuality, and that we all have different ways of viewing it, right? Sexuality across cultures is extremely different. It looks different. Um, the perception, the thought of why do I have sex and why do I engage with somebody, it's always different, but the commonality will be connection, human connection, the need for human connection. And so that's, I think, like that's like the common ground for all the cultures that I worked with. And so it's just the way we interpret it, right? That's the difference. That's a big difference.
Oh, lovely. I love that explanation. I love that explanation. And I'm just wondering, in with your work working with Latin American communities and Middle Eastern communities in the United States, is there a taboo around sex therapy? And if so, how do you overcome that? Sex therapists like yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And definitely, like for Latin Americans, the usual person that's there, it's a sexologist. So it's either whether it is a medical professional or a sexologist. But sex therapy does not exist in South America or in Central America. And so it's really interesting, like the way that we navigate it is different than they navigated. And so we have a common goal, but the way that we do, all of us who are sex therapists are certified therapists, right? Like we have a master's degree of some sort of counseling, therapy, social work, some sort of, or psychology. And so all of us are have the basis of like mental health or any of the things like depression, anxiety, and things like that, or trauma work. And so on top of that, then you specialize for 2 years to become a sex therapist. So that is the main difference is that in South America we don't have certified sex therapists or sex therapists. We have sexologists or medical professionals who work in the sexuality field. Is there a taboo? Absolutely, right? How many people come looking for a sex therapist who are Latin American? First, they look for, I'm going to look for a therapist. And then they get into the layer of, now I can talk about sex. And for, if you talk about like Muslim people specifically, that is a harder layer, right? There's the cultural, who am I going to talk to? What kind of things can I talk about? This is my personal life. And us knowing that it's such a private matter when it comes to Islam, then it becomes difficult, right, to get into that space. But I've had couples who are ready to work and talk about some of the things within an Islamic, obviously, context. And so, yes, taboos exist. They're always present. I think that with any culture in the world, there'll be different taboos when it comes to sexuality.
Mm, yeah. I didn't realize that in Latin America there aren't many sex therapists, so there's sexologists. So I wasn't aware. So sexologists and sex therapists, they're two different professions. Is that correct?
That is correct. Like we have a common goal. We have like we work on similar things. The difference is some sexologists are psychologists, but not all sexologists are therapists. Versus, right, if we're talking only like United States specifically, certified sex therapist is somebody who has gone through therapy training, right? Like all the sex therapy training that they required. So that is the main difference. But again, sexologists work on with couples and with individuals who want to explore anything sexuality related. So they're very well versed in sexuality. That's what they do every day. So we just work a little different.
I'm glad, and that's why I'm trying to educate, especially my audience, and I also obviously will put this up on my institute as well to educate my students as well to understand and appreciate the differences and the professions. And like you being a certified sex therapist, is important that people understand and appreciate that, so that not anyone who speaks about sex or is a counselor is actually, certified like yourself. And you did mention, or I did read in your biography that you are AASECT certified. Can you explain what that is, just so we're
Yeah.
familiar?
Yeah, so AASECT is the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. That is the American association that certifies people to become either sex therapists, certified sex therapist supervisors, counselors, or educators. This is, again, like an umbrella for all sexuality related professions as well. And so that is the organization that I belong to. That's the organization that I work for uh, as a volunteer in the past and currently. So that's where my tribe is. That's where I belong for.
Oh, lovely. Lovely. And speaking of the services that you offer, and I've been looking at your website, and I will put a link below if anyone's watching obviously on YouTube or Instagram or at my institute so they can find out a bit more obviously about the work that you do. But can you tell us a little bit about some of the services that you offer, and are they only in-person services? Do you offer any online services for anyone that's outside of Baltimore, where you're, or
Yes.
Maryland, where you're based?
Absolutely. So I'm a private practice right now, and I'm working on, inshallah, building sexuality healing center, which is my big dream, my big mission on earth. And so I'm working on building that. As a private practice, I am able to see people because I am transitioning into a bigger space. I am currently seeing everybody teletherapy. And as soon as the center is open, I'll be able to see people in person. I work with sexual trauma is probably the biggest component of everything that I do. So being a certified sex therapist, obviously, like I've had a lot of training in trauma and sexual trauma. So I connect spirituality and sexual trauma work into sex therapy. That's what I do. That's like the majority of the work that I do. So yes, absolutely, I can do it online. I'm available to consult with anybody um, and obviously provide services as an educator if that is needed.
Great. And again, just for the benefit of people watching and listening, the website is Dr. Simich Munoz, Doctor, so DrSimich Munoz.com. So
Yes.
www.drSimichMunoz.com, and you can find full information about the different services that the doctor offers, from therapy, workshops, retreats, and like she mentioned, sorry, did you mention that you're moving into a
A bigger
clinical?
space,
Yes.
yes.
So what
So
was the
I've
name?
so the it's a sexual healing center. It's
Sexual healing.
I'm on the works of like the name and website and branding and all of those things. So it will be coming soon. And I'm sure I'll share that information with you as well. The idea of this place is to provide holistic services in one place. So it's not only the sex therapy, but it's also like body work, somatic work, energy work, like all kinds of things to so people can really start moving and shifting some of those energies in their bodies that are stuck, right? Because of sexual trauma or anything else sexuality related. So the goal of the place is for you to come in, spend the day, do different things, align, and eventually be able to start some of that healing process in a faster mode than just sitting in therapy.
Amazing.
Um, yeah.
I'm sorry, can you break down? You mentioned three terms that I wanted to quickly write down, but if you can just define what the first one, just so we're all on the same page, can you
Mhm.
explain what sex therapy is? I mean, sorry, sexual trauma is, sorry.
Absolutely. Sexual trauma is any negative experience that has happened to our bodies, to our minds, to our hearts, in relation to sexuality, right? So anything that was non-consensual in our lifetime, and that might go anything from sexual harassment on the streets all the way to, actual actual rape, sexual assault. So anything within that spectrum, um, yeah, so anything. You might have seen something, you might have heard something, anything that was non-consensual, it's under the umbrella of sexual trauma.
And how common is sexual trauma from your experience?
I see it every day, so very common. I think that in my work with, specifically, I want to say with Latin American women, that's the biggest common factor. When I did research, my PhD research is in sexual citizenship, which is also another thing that I am working on, a book on sexual citizenship and clinical practices that has to do with how do I see myself in the world, like the umbrella of how do I see myself in the world as a sexual being, and how do I navigate spaces, geographical spaces with that sexuality. But going down to the question, the oh, I'm sorry, I lost track. We had the sexual trauma, and then we went into
You was talking about sexual trauma in Latin America, Latin
oh, Latin
communities,
American women.
Latin American.
Yes. One of the biggest findings of my research on sexual citizenship of migrant Peruvian women in the United States, so people like me, was that the socio-political context of Peru in terms of access to sexual rights and rights of women and other populations, transgender LGBTQ communities, um, were basically under the scope of necropolitics, um, meaning, right, like women's bodies don't have the same value. And so most of, or members of the community, LGBT community. And so what ended up happening is that all the women that I interviewed had experienced some sort of sexual trauma, some sort of sexual harassment, sexual advances, or sexual molestation or abuse.
Wow, wow. And were the women themselves able to identify that they had experienced sexual trauma, or is it had to be like through therapy, then they had to realize that this what they experienced was sexual trauma?
Well, the overall question was sexual trauma. And then I
Okay.
broke it down into pieces. Have you ever been touched inappropriately? Have you ever been grabbed inappropriately? Have you ever been catcalled in the street, right? Like, so I break it down. And I think it was similar to, I believe I heard one of your podcasts talking about Brazilian women, right? And the experiences of Brazilian women versus you being a man. So it's like a similar thing, right? Like sometimes we need a different lens to understand the narrative, right? Like what is the person telling us about their story that connects directly to that experience, right? So I didn't label it as sexual trauma for them. They labeled it whatever it was for them, but I had a conversation with them and just like to get their understanding of what it was for them. What was their experience like?
Yeah, that's really fascinating and very important. Yeah, because so even in my experience, like when I went to Brazil, the first time I went, I think it was 2014. Yeah, it was about 10 years ago. And I went to the carnival. Now, obviously, because I'm not Brazilian, I'm an outsider, so I wanted just to observe and just enjoy the carnival. But one of the things which I noticed is that there was it's like a practice where random men will go up to random women and kiss them on their lips. Now, obviously I'm not Brazilian, so I didn't want to I didn't understand like exact something that the women wanted or enjoyed. Because it looks like it's unwanted attention. And when I spoke to a couple of the guys, they were like, "Oh no, all the women like that. That's our culture." But when speaking to the women, they're like, "No, we don't like it, but it's just something that we tolerate." And when I was like,
Mhm.
"Okay, that's sexual harassment," they were like, we don't know what to call it, but yeah, it's not something that we actually tolerate. But it's just interesting that again, sometimes when I spoke to some of the men, they just assumed that this was like normal or this was acceptable behavior. But speaking to the women, although some of them, I think now they are adopting terms like sexual harassment, which is good, and things like that. They didn't accept it, but I think there was like a disconnect between some of like the you could say the perpetrators who just thought that was just fun or like that's just what you do in a carnival, and it's just like no, if you actually speak to the women themselves, like they would tell you otherwise, whether they call it sexual harassment or whatever sexual assault, it's clearly unwanted. But it's just interesting that I found that the disconnect between the men with the women, and they're similar in the UK. So I'm not just blaming Brazil. It just happens also in the
Right.
UK as well. So I'm just wondering with the work that you do. I know you said you do a lot of work with women. Do you also do work with men to educate them about sexual trauma and sexual assault and consent?
Yeah. Yeah, I have plenty. I've worked with plenty of men who have experienced sexual trauma themselves or sexual assault or childhood abuse, right? That had to do with sexuality. And so, yes, I mean, I think that sometimes it's easier for women to call it out, right? And obviously, this is like a patriarchal kind of lens of, right? It's easier for women. I don't want to say easy because it's not easy to talk about like sexual assault, but easier to express emotions surrounding negative experiences that have to do with sexuality. And for men, it is harder to verbalize. So men don't necessarily come to sex therapy, at least for my experience. They don't necessarily come to sex therapy because of sexual trauma, right? That is the least of the experiences that I've had. The majority of men come because of some sort of function thing that is not working the way that they want it to work.
I was just about to ask you that because that's my understanding as well that a lot of the men or the information that I receive is like they have a performance problem, whether it's erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation. So how do they have optimized experience in the bedroom, not really talking about sexual trauma? So I was wondering if you had this similar findings with the work
Right.
and research that you're doing. So yeah, so it's similar across the board, across the board on both sides of the pond. It looks like. And you mentioned something else. I was hoping you could define. You said
Yeah, and
somatic.
I think that that's like across. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, like, this is across cultures, right? Like I have yet to see a Latino man coming to me for sex therapy. So they're usually coming, oh, I'm having erection problems. I'm having premature ejaculation. I'm having these things versus I have this deep experience in my heart that still hurts. And my
Yeah.
body is connected to my mind and to my emotions. Therefore, my body's doing something else, right? So, yes, it takes a little bit of work there.
Yeah. Do you think it might be the I don't know if you call it the marketing or the labeling or things because I've noticed like when I speak to men or do men only workshops, if I mention or have a guest or like a professional and they're speaking about maybe like therapy or intimacy or like well-being, a lot of men don't really turn up or they're not interested. Or if I were to make it quite goal orientated, like have sex like a porn star, the secrets to female pleasure last longer, then a lot of men are more geared to that. And then we can open up and have honest conversations about some of those underlying issues where they need the therapy. But I've just noticed that sometimes, and I do try and find out, okay, why is it oftentimes men are more receptive to more like performative, goal-orientated approaches, but they're still looking for that. They might have these underlying issues where they need the therapy, but unfortunately, they're not as receptive. I found it. I don't know if it's because of a machismo culture or the male bravado, but that's something that I've commonly I've found
Yeah.
that when I'm trying to target or speak to men, it has to be quite goal orientated or performance orientated to kind of get them to kind of somewhat open up. So that's just something that I've noticed.
Yeah, it's performance oriented, right? It's how good can I be? Because it's surrounding masculinity, right? Messages of masculinity that talk about centering sexuality on the penis versus, right? Like there's all these other beautiful things in sexuality that do not relate to the penis. So how can we get into that space? But there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen, obviously, in whether it's sex education or sex therapy that needs to happen before we get there.
Yeah, yeah. And with some of your clients, how do you navigate? Because one of the questions I often receive is women who are in a long-term relationship or married who are feeling like they've been assaulted in their marriage, like raped. And because of maybe some conditioning that they've received, maybe from their society or their religion, where they believe that this concept of marital rape doesn't exist, is that something that you've come across? And how do you help educate the woman that she is entitled to body autonomy and to say no? And, there's no such thing as I mean, there is no such thing as a man can force himself on his wife, or is that something that you've come across? How do you educate or empower the woman as well as the couple in that regard?
Yeah, that's a very hard subject. And so obviously we have like cultural beliefs and religion and all the stuff that's behind that, right? I work a lot with domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And usually, right, like when I'm asking about abuse, all kinds of abuse come up, anything that you can potentially imagine except the sexual abuse, right? Oh, but when I ask for the direct question of, have you ever been sexually abused? They're like, no, I know. And then when I go into the details of, have you ever been coerced, forced, non-consensual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, under influence, anything, it usually comes out, right? So it's this almost extra layer to, I think it's a taboo topic, right? It goes into like those taboo topics that we were talking about, that layer of I'm unable to see this because of the role that it plays in my life, right? I'm supposed to be the wife, for example, right? And as a wife, I need to provide this. And this is my role, right? This scripture or that scripture says that I need to do this. And so I give not necessarily permission because I'm not enjoying it, I'm not getting pleasure, but I'm just doing it. So I think that tackling that one it's a bit hard because you have to deconstruct and that is hard to deconstruct belief systems. I think that anything that harms your body against your will, regardless of it being your partner or not, it's a problem, right? And so that's like the underlying conversation that I have. Did this hurt you in any way? Physical, mental, emotional, spiritually? Were you crying afterwards? Were you anything else afterwards? And then like creating that it's not again, I don't want to go against the value system or belief system, but I do want to like this is your body. And your body, you share it with whom you choose. And so it is consensual. You are allowed to experience pleasure. You are allowed to have sexual desire. So how can you navigate this in a healthy manner where this is not happening? So we go and we deconstruct a little bit, and then we go into the layer of now what do you want with your body? What is it that you want to experience?
Oh, very well said. Very well said. And for someone, I'm just thinking for anyone listening who maybe struggling in that particular sphere, that's where they can maybe contact you for, is that teletherapy? Is that what you refer to as online therapy if they're not in
Yeah, right now we
London?
can do teletherapy. Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yes. So that's yeah, definitely something that we can talk and whether we do therapy or we go into more of consultation or anything else, like yes, I'm more than happy to work with anybody who needs that space. Yeah, that's what I do every day. So
Okay. Great. And the best place for people to contact you, is it via Instagram, email? Obviously, I'll put all your details, but just so people know
my
where how.
ins I'm checking my Instagram every day. So yes, that can definitely be a place. Email is also good. Website email, because my email on my website you could just click and put your information and then I get an email. whatever way. And then there's my phone number, which is also my Instagram. So I also get like text messages from people who are interested. And then normally do a consultation, like a 15-minute consultation, so we can talk and make sure that we're a good fit for each other, that I can help you through this process. And that's how we get into this.
Lovely. Fantastic. And you mentioned something else I was hoping you could define. I wrote it down. The somatic healing you mentioned earlier as part of your
So,
holistic. Can you explain what that is? Somatic healing, I think you refer to it as.
well, I said sexual healing and
Oh, right.
then different somatic practices. So like
Right.
anything that has to do with the body, right? So if I'm healing from sexual trauma, I might have to do some sort of pelvic floor work, or I might have to do some sort of reconnecting to my body, usually, right? Because there's a disconnection. There's specifically with trauma, there's a disconnection of body and brain because of it's so uncomfortable to be in the body. And so when we talk about somatic, means like being in body, being in your body. Um, whether it is with the feelings of my body has betrayed me or my body has experienced something negative. And so like that's trauma work specifically. So anything surrounding body.
Okay, and just again, just a couple of the questions, and this is something that I found on your website, but I thought might be interesting, just some of the
Mhm.
frequently asked questions. The first one is, what can people expect from their first meeting, like with you?
Yeah, like I mentioned, first we're gonna talk 15 minutes, free consultation kind of thing to make sure that I can help you. Once we schedule something, yes, you're gonna sign some document, like confidentiality agreement, teletherapy agreement, things like that, like basic stuff, that's covering you and covering me. And then we set up a 1 hour session, depending on your schedule, my schedule. And during that first interview, I'm there to listen to whatever you need to tell me, right? So this is your narrative, your story. It's not about me as a therapist or the things that I can do. No, this is about you and the capacity that you have to heal and that all of us as human beings have. So we don't have to talk about sexuality the first time because most of my clients don't talk about sexuality the first time, unless they're coming with like pretty heavy sexual trauma and they want to talk about it, right? They're ready. But I hold that compartment, right? As a mental health clinician, I hold the space to have that conversation. Um, and we will just have a conversation. It's nothing. I will ask you about your childhood. I will tap a little bit in there, but first, I'm interested in building a relationship with you, because that's how we human beings relate. And I relate in community. So, and this is a new community that we're building, and how can we work together? That's basically, I will ask you, what do you want to do with this time that we're going to be spending together?
Great. And what kind of sexual health problems can a person treat with therapy with you?
Anything. I think I've seen it. I've seen a lot. So I think I can navigate. If I'm ever stuck on something, or I have never worked with that, I will tell you. I'm pretty transparent, and I hope that, when people just tell me this is what I'm dealing with, and if I have not worked with it, I will tell you. And I might not be the best fit. So anything from you mentioned like I work a lot with women, Latin American women, women of color, as we call it here in the United States, immigrant women. That's kind of like my forte. I work a lot with interracial couples, intercultural couples from different cultures. And so we navigate like the differences of the perspectives of sexuality and right, like based on your experience and my experience, and how can we find common ground, um, communication, relationships. I can work with erectile dysfunction, with all the other usual things, vaginismus, anything else that needs to be worked through.
I'm interested. You said you work with interracial, intracultural couples. So is that where you need to work with each of the couples individually or together in a session?
Both, both. So during like the initial session, we will meet together. I want to know what the dynamics of the relationship are so I can understand it. And then I might ask for, after follow-up individuals. When it comes to cultures, right? Like we all have different belief system. It's the first conversation, the first thing that we talked about today. is we all have different belief systems. And so when we're with a partner who's from a different culture, from a different everything, who has different life experiences, even based on oppression or any systemic discrimination or anything else, it would create trouble for us to connect sexually. And so we got to talk about all those layers. So when I work with people, I go from that intersectional lens. Like I'm going into how does it feel for you to be with this person who looks this way, who has experienced these things, right? And then we go into how can we get closer when it relates to sexuality.
Amazing, amazing. And I'd like to talk about this is how I actually first came across your work. So I think it was about maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, but it was a research paper that I think you presented in 2017, I believe.
Yes,
Yourself and Dr. Shannon Chavez. I
yes,
think it was entitled "Islam and Sexuality" by two Latin American converts in the US, which is the
yes.
title alone was like, okay, that was really intriguing. Do you mind giving an overview in terms of what that research was about and and your findings? Because yeah, that was
Yeah. So Dr. Chavez and I have known each other for a while, and so we've been in trainings before together. I met her when I was in training as a sex therapist, and so we became friends, right? We were colleagues, we're friends, and so the common experience that we had is that both of us are reverted back to Islam, and so that piece makes us unique. Unicorns, of course, being Latin American, majority Catholic, and so we started having conversations about it and what would it mean to have something, right? To publish something or to even like just do the conversation because it was a conversation starter that we still have pending work to do. And so when we decided to Shannon decided to sorry, Dr. Chavez decided to have start talking to women in her community and to start talking about sexuality. What were some of the perspectives? What were some of the things? What were they interested in? Right? Like, so it was more like an inquiry. And so I did the same here in Baltimore. So Dr. Chavez being in Los Angeles and me being here in Baltimore, two different coasts, which are almost like two different cultures in the US. We started talking to different populations, right? I see mostly Middle Eastern women versus she sees, I believe, mostly African women. And so we started talking and having open dialogue conversations of what do you want to know about sex? What do you feel is important? What would you have wanted to know before getting married? Or what do you know now before getting married? So like kind of like inquiring of the things and the needs that these women had. And again, very informal conversations. And so us being kind of not insiders but outsiders, right? Because we were raised differently, right? This is something that we decided to go. This is a path that we decided to go in. So we had that curiosity, that that kind of inquiry of, well, I was raised very liberal, so how does it, right, like go into a more conservative culture? And the biggest finding, I believe, for both of us was that women were like they were craving those conversations, those spaces, having conversations surrounding sexuality, knowing more ahead of time. So the component of sex education, and not sex education from a Western lens, but more of sex education of what can I expect the first night that we're together, right? What can I expect if I'm feeling tightness in my vulva? What are some of those things that I need to know and be aware of? What could be a medical thing, right? How can I connect in different ways? And then obviously there's the layer of like Islamically, what can I do, right? What am I allowed to do, and what can I explore with my partner? And so so it came out of very like curious mindset because we were in the community and both of us wanted to talk about this. She's an advocate for sexuality, me too. Right. And so I've done sex education at the masjid, working with a sheikh before. I'm trying to get into my masjid again so I can do more of that because I feel like especially like young women and young men need it, right? We need to have a space that is safe to talk about sexuality. So then nothing gets misconstrued later. So then they know that they own their bodies and that they can experience pleasure. And we can do it, from that perspective of like a more conservative perspective rather than go have sex with anybody, right? Like that's not, it could be for somebody who is, and that's fine, that's their thing. But to talk about sexuality in any setting with young people, it's extremely important in any community. That's the work that I love.
Amazing, amazing. And the paper that you presented, um, I saw it online or a tweet. Was that the World Sexual?
I,
Can't remember.
yeah, yeah, the WAS, the World Association of Sexuality. That was again in 2017. I hope that I'm presenting next year on sexual citizenship of migrant women. But yes, that is the big world congress, I guess. World, right? World Congress on Sexuality.
Well done,
So an
kudos to you.
international, yeah.
Yeah, no, well, very well done. And can you talk to us if you can about the upcoming presentation that you said you're working on?
I'm working on so many things. I mean, I don't sleep. No, I do sleep. I do take rest. That's important to me for my spirit. Um, Upcoming things. I'm teaching at a few universities because that's what I do. I teach on sexuality, on sex therapy, on practical skills to work with couples. I have two big plans that are coming up next summer. I plan on having a retreat in Peru, in Cusco, Peru, and that would be up in the Andes, in the mountains, and we'll do a lot of like healing, Andean healing, which is just like being on earth, be connected to earth, be connected to nature, and learn about sexuality and nature. So eco sexuality, a little bit of that. And this will be for therapists or anybody else that is interested in joining, any other therapist that is interested in joining, a therapist or just professional that works in sexuality. And then a big retreat that I'm signing that will be happening in Costa Rica at the beginning of 2026. We'll be having a workshop. All of these are, I'll be able to provide CEUs, specifically AASECT credit hours for people who are training towards becoming certified. So those are like the two things. And then for books, I'm working on a book on sexual citizenship, which is my topic, and practical clinical applications of 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 sexual citizenship.
I'm sorry, can you define what do you mean by sexual citizenship?
Oh my God. We'll be here forever. Have you like okay. Sexual citizenship, umbrella
Yeah.
of everything that you can think of sexuality, sexual pleasure, sexual desire, sexual rights, um, exploration of sexual self. So it's usually the intersection between my body, my rights, my sexuality, and system. So it's an intersectional um, theme, right? It's how do I navigate? So as a example, as a Peruvian woman who is an immigrant living in the United States for so long, what does it mean for me to live in Baltimore specifically and access my sexual rights and access my own sexual journey and access, right? Like, so it's access based on positionality and
Mhm.
systemic positionality. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. So how can I bring all of those things? And that's what I do in sex therapy and when I'm teaching to students and supervisees. How can I bring all that into the sex therapy room with practical applications? How can I go over, how can I know about the war that my client experienced and how that is impacting their sexuality? How can I know about the gang threats that my client went through so I can understand how it impacts their sexuality, right? Like, so it's this very intersectional lens of going back and forth into a very academic concept into like the practical things of what we need to do with sex therapy.
And does one's culture or cultural understanding impact sexuality?
Absolutely. The sexual citizenship is definitely impacted by culture. The biggest components, again, socio-cultural perspective, it's a huge one. The time, the time that you were being raised in as a child, as an adolescent, if you were in an area of conflict, of war or anything like that, it highly impacted your sexuality. So you might not know it yet. You might not even think of it. You might think it's just like the nightmares or the flashbacks or something like that, but it's impacting you, how present you are with your partner in that space. So yes, it's a culture, yes, religion, yes, and socio-political lens, necropolitics, as I was saying, right?
Mhm.
is your body allowed to experience or not allowed to experience?
Right. And sorry, can you explain a bit more about the social political lens? How does that impact one's
Yeah.
understanding of sexuality?
Yeah. So for example, if you were living in a dictatorship, right? What kind of restrictions did you have as growing up as a child or even being an adult in that space? What kind of things did you have access to? So maybe you didn't have access to contraception, for example, right? Because it was surveilled by government. And so that directly impacts the way that you're going to experience sexuality now. Because how can you think of um, how can I be away from, you know, I want to protect myself and I want to have contraception, but because of my experience and no access to it, and power told me that I didn't have access to it. And now how do I experience my sexuality? But I want to protect myself, but I'm so afraid that a system is going to look over this. That's what I mean by sociopolitical, like all the changes that were happening behind you, kind of
Mhm.
around you
Mhm.
geographically, and how that impacted you. You might not perceive it yet, but that's how you break through the intersections of sexuality, even in a deeper layer.
Oh, wow. No, that's powerful. And I'm just keen to understand as well. Um, I understand I know you said that a lot of the work you're doing is with the women. What advice, if any, would you give to help men who maybe their partner is struggling with sexual trauma, sexual abuse?
Oh, wow.
How can you,
Mhm.
what advice could you give to men who may be listening and watching?
Mhm. To hold space, right? Understanding that it's not an easy subject. It's not something that can easily be talked about. Um, you probably don't need the details of everything that happened to your partner. But what you need to know is that it did impact. It is still probably impacts their bodies, their minds, their hearts, all of it. And so how can you so think about as a man, and hopefully with emotional intelligence going into that space of understanding, I need to hold space for my partner. Let me open the door to her giving me a conversation about anything that she might need. Hey, whenever you're ready, I love you and I support you. And I want you to know that whenever you want to, I am here to talk about anything that you might want. But also for the part, like for the, let's say for the man to have a support system with that, right? Because I think it's very emotional. If you think of, oh, my partner was raped, that is very heavy, right? It weighs heavy on the heart because this is somebody you love and that you want to protect. And so how can you go back into protecting also yourself, right? So have some sort of, whoever it is in your community who is helping you emotionally, supporting you, but also without disclosing, obviously, whatever your partner told you, but being in that space and letting your partner know that you're there. And that's all you need to do.
Oh, that's amazing. That's very well said. Very well said indeed. And do you have any more? I know you said you've got a couple of research papers you're working on. Do you have any other events or workshops that you've got upcoming that you'd like to promote or talk about?
Peru, July of 2025.
Yeah.
Retreat in Costa Rica. Jeff, it's either I'm trying to fine tune the dates, January or February of 2026. Book, that's ever ending. Hopefully next year it'll be out. And then yeah, those are like the main things I think. And obviously, like, on my Instagram, there are Wednesdays that I jump on and have a cafecito mañanero, which is mañanero is a word for I don't know if you know that word, if you ever heard it, but
I'm
mañanero
not.
is the early morning sex. That's the word, mañanero. It's mañana, it's early, right, morning. And so I named it cafecito mañanero. So you have your coffee and you have a conversation about sexuality. So I come on live Wednesdays normally if I don't have any other family duties to do. I will come on this Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. to just talk about any sexuality topic, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if they just put them on the chat.
And that's 9:30 Eastern Standard Time,
Wednesday, Eastern, US Eastern Standard Time. Yes.
US Eastern, and your Instagram is Dr. Simich __. Munoz.
Oh,
So it's
yes.
dr.simich_Munoz. You find the full, that's Dr. Estefania's Instagram page, and you can find more about. I like that expression. So, what did you call it? The coffee and sex, early
Yeah,
morning.
yeah. So I wanted again, I love talking about sexuality in a very open manner. And I think it's advocacy, right? Like the work that we do talking about sexuality has to do with advocacy and holding space for the people that need it, that need to talk about these things. And sometimes we're too shy to call a therapist or talk about. That's why I say, like, you can just put a question and I'll answer it. I'll contact you, I'll DM you, we'll figure it out, right? And so a lot of people don't want to put themselves out there. And so I decided to just go on live, have an open space. You can ask me anything. Sometimes I have topics, sometimes I'm just saying hi, and then we can just I'm there. I'm just present. So cafecito mañanero, like the early morning, right? Sex, but it doesn't say sex. Mañanero is usually for Latin Americans, we know what it means.
Okay, so in Latin America, that expression, early morning, is it early morning coffee means early morning sex? Is that what it means? It's like a play on
No, no,
words.
no. No, no, no. We take the cafecito out. Cafecito is coffee, right? Little coffee. The mañanero one. A mañanero is an early morning sex.
Okay. Oh,
But it
marinero is.
means yes, there we go. So now you have it. So I name it Cafecito Mañanero. Yeah.
No, lovely. And before we wrap up, do you mind? We don't have time to talk about your article as well, which what was the book called again? An intersectional approach to sex therapy.
Ah,
I think was that the
yes,
book
that's
name of the
it.
book?
That's the
An
one.
intersectional approach to sex therapy.
That
Do you
is,
mind talking a little bit about because I love that article, but do you mind talking about the article that you wrote and the findings?
yes, absolutely. So this was while I was still in grad school. And so colleagues, friends of mine reached out. There was a call for authors, and I just submitted, and I'm like, okay, maybe I get it, maybe I don't. And so I submitted a chapter on kind of like understanding better what does it mean to, and this is not a generalization in any kind of way. It's just an example of what it meant for one of a Latin American client who was experiencing specific things regarding their sexuality, and for one of my Middle Eastern clients who was North African actually, who was experiencing something with their sexuality, and how we navigated the process, right? So it is the chapter is case conceptualization. So we're talking about like the case, kind of I give you a background of who this person is, um, what happened to them, and what were some of the things that we did in therapy, in sex therapy. So if you're like interested in sex therapy, it gives you like very detailed, okay, this is what we did, this were some of the interventions, and what was the outcome, right? And of course, that was there's no definite end, because I continued to work with those two people afterwards. So, but it was more of, okay, again, going into their narratives, understanding where they come from, how does culture, how does religion influence their exploration of sexuality, and what do they want to do with it in the therapy room, right? What are the limitations and the areas of exploration that we can have in this conversation? So, um, again, beautiful collaboration. There's only one of its kind when it comes to intersectional sex therapy. And all the colleagues that are writing in that book are pretty powerful sexuality game changers, right? Like they're doing the work within community. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was a really a great read. I love the book, especially obviously your chapters, and I do highly recommend it. I did post about it a while back when I read, I think last year or 2 years ago.
Yes.
What are, if any, similarities between Latin American culture and mainly if we could talk about maybe Peruvian culture and the Middle Eastern culture that you've come across in relation
Yeah.
to sexuality or women's
Yeah.
sexuality?
So maybe in my past life I was right, Middle Eastern, but I feel like there's a lot of commonality. The biggest one is community, how everything is surrounding community, right? The influence of community into your life as an individual, and how it potentially can impact your sexuality. The other one is family, which is surrounding community, right? Like family messaging, family values, very similar, right? I think that sometimes people think, oh, we might be worlds away, and so we're super different, and this is more conservative. Come on, Latin American culture in general is very conservative. And there might be specific spots where it's not, but in general, in the general sense, it is highly Catholic, highly Christian, right? So there's that conservative religious layer, obviously of colonialism and all of those layers. And so they're very similar, very family oriented, community oriented, food, everything, love is surrounded by food. So food is a big factor in both communities. Music as well. Expressions of how you experience music or might be different. In Latin American culture, right? There's very sexualized lyrics in music versus in Middle Eastern, like it might not be sexualized, right? Like, but there's like there's similarities of experiencing life. So I think that that's like the biggest. And every time I'm, standing, I'm leaving in 3 weeks to Egypt. So every time I go back, it's like I'm going back to me, right? Which I was raised in South America, but it's like going back to Egypt is me. I don't know how to put it. I was
Um,
Egyptian. I don't know.
yeah, I lived in Egypt for just over 3.5 years. I love culture. It's very rich and diverse, and especially northern Egypt's very different to southern Egypt as well. But yeah, it's I do share that same sentiment. Just the last question, and I know we think we touched. I'm not sure if we touched on it. Around conversations around consent. Is that something that discussions are had, especially like in Latin American and Middle Eastern clients that you have, like around discussion around consent, especially within the context of a marriage or like long-term relationship?
Yes, yes, we have constant conversations on consent. That is probably like at the end, like the core of everything that has to do with sex therapy. Right? It has to do with the way that I've been trained from a positive sex lens. And so yes, everything, if you agree to it and you said yes and it was consensual, you can always remove consent. You can always say no, I don't want that part of that, or right, or say no, not today. Today you remove your consent, right? Like those conversations, yes, that's a constant thing that comes up with all my clients, especially coming from patriarchal cultures where we've learned that, right, women have learned or been socialized to believe like, right, you must do the thing, right? So that is there.
And what advice, just the last question, would you give to any woman who's like married, who doesn't feel like she has the right to consent? So she's having relations with her husband, she doesn't enjoy it, it's forced, but she believes that's her role. That's what she's been taught from her religion and her culture. What advice would you give to such a woman?
That is probably not, that is probably culture, that is not religion, right? Like that'll be the first one. And you've written about erotology, so in Islam, so you know that piece. The first one is I want to know more about the relationship and what holds her in that space. And sometimes we know finances for a lot of women across the globe are a thing, right? Dependence on men financially, or the provider, or I'm married and this is the person I chose to marry. But I believe that if it's, and so that we come into the crossroads of abuse of a relationship, of like intimate partner violence in general. But if there is if they want to be in that relationship, can they have a conversation? So I will challenge, like, can you have a conversation with your partner about this? Can you tell them how it makes you feel? Because if your partner, right, is the right partner and it's a partner that loves you, they should hear this from you. If it's a partner that doesn't care for you and doesn't care about your feelings or your emotions, then more than likely they won't care. So what does that tell you about the relationship? And I know that not everybody who's in an abusive relationship can get out, right? I know that. There's several layers of circumstances that can be there. But can you have this conversation? That's the big question. Can you have this conversation with your partner? And if you can't, why can't you have it? What kind of relationship is that?
Sorry, just one last thing, because I've just noticed something that you do,
You
which
can
is
stay
really
here.
brilliant. Sorry. And I don't know if this is, I'm assuming it's probably down to your training because I've noticed Dr. Shannon did something similar as well. Is I've noticed when you speak, you don't like like say this is what you should do or you should leave. It's more kind of helping the person understand what's best for them kind of thing. Is that what therapy entails? Because that style, because usually if I were to ask that same question to someone who's not a professional, it would be leave. You don't, which again, that's I can understand with their sentiment, but I'm saying just the way you've worded that, it's a case of empowering the person themselves to know that they shouldn't be abused. And so I'm just wondering, is that part of your training or is that your own personal style? Because that's something that I've picked up and I'm learning from, like just the way you're answering
Yeah,
those
I
questions.
think it's humanity, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm a human that has had experiences, and that person who's sitting there with me, who's trusting me in this space, has experiences. And I'm not there, right? Like as therapists, at least for counselors, social workers in the US or psychologists, like you don't tell people what to do, right? They ask you for advice all the time and they ask you, hey, what can I do? And then we can go like decipher your options, but of course, if you're in an abusive relationship, leave. But with an understanding, I understand. I worked in this field for many, many years, and I know that people cannot just leave. I work with immigrant women who don't, right, who might not have access to living anywhere. They have 5 children, they're in an abusive relationship, but that's all they got. So how do you ask somebody from Guatemala or El Salvador to just leave? Like you can't. There has to be a whole support system to it, right? So my focus is one is for the person to understand their narrative. What are they saying about themselves that could potentially help them? What are the kind of like the loopholes where we can find spaces for you to create change? Maybe it's, I start taking care of myself and I take a walk, and maybe that helps me with that energy that I have stuck in me. And yeah, I am afraid that my husband is going to show up and it's going to like hurt me or do something that I don't want, but I'm doing this piece. How can I like, so it's a harm reduction kind of like perspective, like seeing which pieces can I take from these. And then the other one is the community, the healing in community, right? And I know that a lot of people that might be seeing you or in the space or might be seeing me in my space are people who live in community, who navigate life in community. And I think that that's very important, right? Because the change, sure, starts with you, but for community-oriented people, it starts also with community. So who are you hanging out with? Who is your support system? Who is telling you, oh, leave that man? And who's telling you do not leave that man, right? Like that kind of thing. Or woman, right? Because it can be abuse can be from anybody. So I do want to say that. So I think it's more of the person has to create change. And I will provide tools and I provide the space. And then we can figure it out together.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's well said. And I think it's important, and that's why, yeah, I love the answer you gave. And I just think it's important for people to hear that because the answer you gave is very nuanced. And again, it's speaking as a human to another human, but it's not just because sometimes one of my bugbears is that when people will, or like sometimes I'll post certain things on Instagram, just ask for people's thoughts and the lack of nuance, and when people just not even trying to understand the context, not even seeking. Very rarely do people ask for more information. It's just like straightforward. The answer is like you don't know what the person's situation is. It's very easy to say just up and leave. And like you said, if the person is, maybe there's 5 children, 5 kids, and they don't have anywhere else to go, it's very easy when you're to have, and that's I'm just, and again, I'm just grateful for what you said, and I just hopefully people that listening can understand that as well. And even if maybe their friend or someone they know has come to them with a problem, if they're not able to give the proper advice, then signpost them to someone like yourself who can give them the proper therapy. Because I think what I've noticed nowadays is that a lot of people have become like armchair therapists or psychologists, maybe because they've watched a couple of podcasts, read a couple of books, and they want to give this, and that can be just as harmful as anything, it's like giving saying the wrong information and things like that. So no, I commend you for what you did and just yeah, I'm grateful for what you said because I think it's that nuance piece is extremely important and helping the person, giving them the tools like you mentioned to hopefully make the right decision for themselves. So, Dr. Stefania, it's been an absolute pleasure. Again, I'm going to put the full links of your website, your Instagram page. So obviously, people can follow about your upcoming retreat and the morning coffee. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Spanish.
And it's bilingual. It's in
Oh,
Spanish,
bilingual.
it's in English. So some
Okay.
Wednesdays I'm talking in English, some Wednesdays I'm talking in Spanish. So it's
No,
kind of like hit or miss. So
no, 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 that's great. And then so I'm looking forward to seeing your upcoming research and hopefully look forward to you doing more collaborative work. I know you mentioned you did some work in some mosques with some sheikhs. I think that's
Mhm,
definitely needed because especially like in a lot of Muslim communities, a lot of those questions are going to like imams who a lot of them are not trained and
mhm.
they don't have the necessary training. So that's why it's important they reach out to people like yourself who have the necessary qualification, expertise. They can either guide them or they can be when they have those queries, they can refer them to experts like yourself to get that the necessary help and therapy that they do desperately need. So again, thank you very much. Jazakallah khairan. It's been an absolute pleasure. Just coming to the hour mark, which is great. Um, and yeah, hopefully we'll keep in touch soon. But yeah, just want to say thank you very much for the work and keep
Yeah,
doing what you're doing.
absolutely, Habib. Thank you so much for the space. I am very grateful to you, and yeah, look forward to collaborating also with you. Who knows? Maybe we create something together.
Inshallah, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay, thank you everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.